Hi, everybody. My name is Loren. I'm here to read my paper, Stitched in Time, Mary Beaudry's Influence in the Study of Small Finds. I'm sorry I can't be there today, and I hope everybody's well and continues to be well. I want to thank Loren, Sarah, and Karen for organizing this session honoring Mary Beaudry, her work and influence. I also want to start by recognizing that I am coming to you from the traditional ancestral homeland of the Massachusetts, the traditional inhabitants of what is now known as Cambridge and Medford, Massachusetts, where I'm coming to you from today. So from her work at the Spencer Peirce Little House to her groundbreaking publication, Findings, Mary Beaudry's focus on small finds has influenced a generation of scholars, and I am one of them. While I had been familiar with Mary's work through graduate school, I really came to know her as I was finishing my dissertation, which focused on clothing and adornment, dress and identity at a Spanish colonial site in present-day Western Louisiana. At that time, more than 20 years ago now, the number of historical archaeologists working on small finds could literally be counted on one hand. In Mary, I found a strong mentor and colleague in our shared interests. Through her work, she stitched together a new community of scholars interested in small finds related to clothing and sewing. She connected me with other scholars, including my friends and colleagues at this session today, who shared the same geeky intensity of those little things often overlooked. Mary often argued that small finds have big histories. Small finds, such as artifacts of clothing and needlework, are relatively uncommon in most archaeological sites. Because of their scarcity, such artifacts tend to receive cursory attention in archaeological analysis and are often presumed to be known by their function, symbols used when sewing. In her work, however, Mary rejected that common interpretation. Instead, she took a deeper look into this artifact category to illuminate nuanced and intensely personal stories of women and their work that could be found in just a simple item, such as a thimble. Mary had such a wonderful approach for exploring the ways in which a single item could speak volumes and tell intimate stories. She often started her work by considering the object itself and an antidote, using material analysis, archival sources, and literature to weave together intricate and imaginative narratives. In the time remaining, I want to give a paper that's inspired by her work. So this small 18th century thimble was recovered from Harvard Yard. Of the thousands of 18th century artifacts recovered from our excavations in the yard, the majority are architectural. No surprise looking at the campus here today. Nails, bricks, and slate are common items that show up in the screens of the undergraduate archaeologists who we work alongside. Ceramics, smoking pipes, and glass are the next largest grouping, followed by a fraction of the total assemblage that could be classified as small finds, such as this thimble. In fact, only 3 18th century thimbles have been recovered from Harvard Yard. At first glance, it would be easy to overlook this small find. But Mary's research on thimbles, however, provides us with an inspiration to look deeper at the significance of this object at 18th century Harvard. So let me talk a little bit about Findings and the work that Mary did on thimbles. So in Findings, Mary placed a thimble at the scene of the 1682 crime. A lost thimble was used as evidence in the trial of Grace Stout, a housemaid for Goody Foster of Ipswich, Massachusetts, and was used to convict her of petty theft. A silver thimble was found in the linen cupboard of Goody Foster that had been emptied of said linens. Grace was found guilty of the theft. She was known to steal in the community and often bought goods above her station, in this case, a silver thimble, which was far too costly and fine to be owned by a mere housemaid. In Findings, Mary used the story of this thimble, ubiquitous and ordinary, as a foil to talk about thimbles through space and time, their manufacture, production, chronology, and significance in various contexts. Most importantly, Mary looked beyond the simple function of the object, that a thimble is just used when sewing, to talk about how thimbles were deployed in the construction of personal and social identities. And one great example she had about thimbles is how she talked about them as a medium for inculcating identities. For example, of this in findings were child-sized thimbles recovered from the 17th century myth of Prinetown, located in Massachusetts, excavated by Steve Rosnowski and the Fifth Center, UMass Boston. At Magunko, Mary argued that Indigenous girls were instructed in English techniques of sewing by Puritan missionaries as a colonial assimilation strategy. Once they learned to sew in English-style fashions, they could sew English-style clothing, learn English feminine ideals, and also keep idle hands out of the devil's workshop, which is a real concern in Puritan Massachusetts. Mary's research not only provides us with the interpretive inspiration, but also gives us the tools to date this thimble from Harvard Yard to the 18th century. Made from copper alloy, the thimble's hand-punched indentations known as nodelings, the classic waffle-style shaped crown, and the slightly faired rim indicates that this thimble dates to the 18th century. The style and type of thimble was introduced by John Lofting, who was a Dutch thimble manufacturer who established a thimble factory in England in the 18th century. Lofting-style thimbles were extremely popular throughout the 18th century and were regularly shipped to New England. Lofting thimbles were produced in various sizes, from the largest, made to be worn by adult male tailors, to very small thimbles that were to be worn by children, such as this thimble from Harvard Yard. And through Mary's interpretive work and the tools she gives us to date and provide a chronology, this thimble from Harvard Yard gains significance and demands our attention. So let me talk a little bit about 18th century Harvard. 18th century Harvard was a community of scholars that grew from Puritan beginnings. The college was established in 1636 as the place of learning in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Until the first decade of the 18th century, English and a small number of Indigenous students went to the Harvard to become Puritan ministers. Puritanism was a central ideology at Harvard until the first decade of the 18th century, when Increase Mather, famous for his involvement in the 1692 Salem witch trials, was replaced by President Samuel Willard. The Salem witch trials and their fallout marked the beginning of the gradual erosion of puritanical thought in the institutional framework of Harvard. In 1708, Willard was replaced by John Leverett, who was the first secular president of Harvard, and then he was later replaced by Presidents Benjamin Wadsworth and Edward Holyoake in the 18th century. While nearly 50% of the graduating students in the first part of the 18th century were still trained as ministers, Harvard historian Samuel Morrison noted that the 18th century students were from an increasingly more diverse group, coming from wealthy merchant families. And he noted that, quote, "This is a new crop of young men that came to meet a gentleman and not just to study," end quote. So the archaeological record bears out part of this story, as material culture suggests the implications of institutionality in daily life. Bricks, nails, and glass speak to the investment that the college made in constructing this place of learning and this social and physical landscape in Cambridge. Other artifacts speak to dining, smoking, and other activities. One thing to note, though, is that the college laws of 1734 dictated that students were to behave themselves blamelessly, leading sober, righteous, and godly lives. Although no longer under this way of Puritanism, the daily lives of students included scripture readings, strict attendance at sermons and prayers, proper dress and decorum on the college grounds and in Cambridge, as well as lessons in mathematics, natural and moral philosophy. Students were to sit at commons or meals according to their rank, some sitting above the salt as this spoke their status. But what we find in the archaeological record complicates things a bit. With no surprise to anyone, tobacco pipes and wine bottle fragments are found in abundance, even though drinking wine and smoking tobacco were largely prohibited and included in the college laws of 1734, suggesting maybe that student life never changes. And when Anglican minister Whitmore visited Harvard in the early 1740s, He labeled the college of a house of impiety and sin. This was an entitled group of students, and they flaunted it. In her most recent article in Historical Archaeology, Christina Hodge investigates the white male privilege of codependent systems of patriarchy, racism, and classism that was created at Harvard in the 18th century. Wadsworth House, shown here, one of the oldest standing structures on campus, was home to college presidents Wadsworth and Holyoke and their families, student lodgers, servants, and at least 4 enslaved men and women, Venus, Titus, Juba, and Bilhah, between 1726 and 1769. These enslaved individuals are memorialized by a plaque that was placed in Wadsworth House in 2016, shown here, as well as the continued work of the Harvey and Legacy of Slavery Project. Material culture for this assemblage, as Christina notes, then includes the labor of African and Indigenous students and laborers, while also suggesting their skilled participation of these individuals in intimate domestic materialities of gentility. So it is from this solidly 18th century context, steeped in gentility and patriarchy, as well as racism and privilege, that this small child's thimble was recovered. As Mary noted, we know what thimbles like this were used for. They protected the skin and sewing and embroidery work. The real work of making clothes for the family was given to tailors in the community and in the households of enslaved women and servants. A little thimble such as this, with little or no wear, however, wasn't used for that kind of making. Rather, it was used by young girls who were raised in such an environment of gentility and privilege and were taught to embroider, cross-stitch, and mend. These competencies at the needle were an embodiment of their status and place in the world. Who then was the owner of this thimble? What kind of story can it tell us about young girls in this institution of scholars? We know so little about young women at Harvard in the 18th century, beyond that children of the presidents lived at the college. What was the life of these young women raised in this college environment of impiety and sin? So Benjamin Wadsworth, shown here on the left, was in office from 1725 to 1737 and had just one son. Edward Holyoke, shown on the right, was in office from 1739 to 1769. Mary would want me to note that his nickname among the students was Guts because of his girth. Holyoke was married 3 times and had 9 children, 6 of whom were girls: Margaret, Mary, Priscilla, Anna, Hannah, and Jane. From Holyoke's diary, we know that the girls spent their time between Marblehead, Massachusetts, where Holyoke had been a Congregationalist minister, in Cambridge. Holyoke's diary included various comings and goings at the college, the births and deaths in the family, when cider and candles were made, when pears and mulberries were planted, and when college orchard was mowed, all labor done by enslaved individuals and servants. The details of his daughter's daily lives are notably absent, except for his note that in 1742, he paid for Peggy, his oldest, to attend dancing school. The daily lives of Holyoke's wives and daughters are instead found in their own diaries, which outline their days. Edward's second wife, Mary Holyoke, her diary includes a dizzying array of social and domestic activities for her and her daughters. Frequently taking tea with Cambridge neighbors, going to dances and dinners, tending to the sick in the community, as well as needle arts, including making cravats, embroidery, and turning the hems of a gown. None of this labor at the needle was arduous. Mary Holyoke wasn't training her daughters at the needle to be seamstresses. Rather, they were taught to embroider and cross-stitch to embellish their clothing and their admittedly privileged lives as daughters of the college president. The child's thimble, recovered from a refugee's context outside Wadsworth House, then speaks to the quiet life, or the quiet work, that led to the creation of a female, genteel, pious identity within an institution of scholarly male privilege. I'd like to reflect on this a little bit more because I think that Mary would have done the same. Young girls were being trained as genteel daughters alongside privileged male scholars in a community that includes slave individuals and servants. Holyoke's daughters never attended sermons and lectures alongside male students, and they were absent at commons, where students sat according to their status. Student diaries and university archival accounts, such as the records of the stewards and butlers of the college, never mention young women. And then, in fact, they don't even mention that they were on campus, similar to the way in which enslaved individuals and servants who labored at Harvard were silenced in the archives. Holyoke's daughters were not named in the disorderly records of the college, which details the rebellious lives of students in their midst. Rather, through the work of their needle, this young women cannot be dismissed out of hand, as they actually helped create a college community as more than just scholars. They stepped over those broken bottles and tobacco pipes discarded by students to attend tea. They learned to dance and embroider as they spoke their status, and they became wives and mothers of ministers and leaders of Massachusetts. Mary would have had a humorous anecdote or a softly spoken sarcastic comment to add here, but I want to end by thanking Mary for her scholarship, which inspired this talk. And Mary, you are so very missed. Thank you very much.